The test pilot checks his instruments at 0900 hours on August 2nd, 1942. Sergei Anokin sits in the turret of a T-60 light tank. Except this T-60 has wings attached. 18-meter wingspan biplane wings mounted above the hull. A twin-tail assembly extending behind the turret. Detachable landing gear under the tracks. The entire contraption weighs 7,500 kilograms. Looks like engineering joke, and is about to be towed into the air by a Tupolev TB-3 bomber to test whether Soviet engineers have solved the problem of delivering tanks to battlefields without roads or railways. The concept is simple. Attach wings to tank. Tow behind bomber. Release near target. Glide to landing. Detach wings. Drive into combat. The execution is insane. The tank is too heavy. The wings generate insufficient lift. The TB-3 cannot maintain altitude while towing, and the entire project assumes German forces will not shoot down a lumbering bomber towing a gliding tank in 40 minutes. The TB-3 will cut the tow rope early because the strain is too great. Anokin will glide the tank to a landing in a field outside Moscow. And the program will be quietly canceled because even Soviet desperation in 1942 has limits, and those limits do not include mass-producing flying tanks. But for one flight, the Antonov 40 Krylia Tanka, wings for tank, will prove that engineering can accomplish almost anything if you ignore whether you should accomplish it, demonstrating that sometimes the craziest ideas are crazy for good reasons, and that innovation driven by desperation produces experiments that belong in museums as evidence of what seemed reasonable under circumstances that made survival more important than sanity. The A-40 originated in desperation and operational necessity. By mid-1942, the Soviet Union was fighting for survival. Germany had invaded in June 1941 with 3 million men, over 3,000 tanks, and complete operational surprise. The initial German advances captured vast territory, destroyed Soviet armies, and reached the outskirts of Moscow and Leningrad. Soviet forces retreated, fighting delaying actions, trading space for time. The Soviet military faced fundamental logistics problem. Moving forces quickly to threatened sectors, the Soviet Union had limited road network. The railway system, while extensive, was vulnerable to German attack and could not always deliver forces where needed rapidly enough. Airborne forces offered solution. Paratroopers could be dropped behind enemy lines or into defensive positions quickly. But paratroopers were light infantry. They lacked heavy weapons and armor. They could hold positions temporarily, but could not conduct sustained operations against German armored forces. The solution seemed obvious. Deliver armored vehicles by air. If you could drop paratroopers by parachute, why not drop their supporting weapons the same way? Light vehicles and artillery could be parachuted. The VDV, Soviet Airborne Forces, had experimented with parachuting light tanks and vehicles since the 1930s. The tests showed it was possible, but difficult. The vehicles needed heavy parachutes, the aircraft needed modifications, and the landing impact often damaged the vehicles. Gliders offered alternative. Instead of dropping vehicles by parachute, tow them in gliders. The glider could land, unload the vehicle, and the vehicle would be operational immediately. The British and Americans were developing similar concepts. The British Hamilcar glider could carry a light tank. American Waco gliders could carry jeeps and artillery. The Soviets wanted similar capability. But Soviet industrial capacity was strained. Aircraft production focused on fighters and bombers. Transport aircraft were in short supply. Gliders required specialized construction. The factories that could build gliders were already producing combat aircraft. Diverting production to gliders meant fewer fighters and bombers. Oleg Antonov, aircraft designer working at Design Bureau OKB 153, proposed radical alternative. Instead of building gliders to carry tanks, convert the tanks themselves into gliders. Attach wings directly to the tank. Tow the flying tank behind a bomber. Release near the target. The tank glides to landing, detaches the wings, and immediately engages in combat. No specialized glider needed. No separate landing and unloading. The tank delivers itself. The concept was audacious. Tanks were not designed to fly. They were heavy, dense, aerodynamically unsuited for flight. But Antonov argued the engineering was feasible. The T-60 light tank weighed approximately 6,400 kilograms combat loaded. Contemporary gliders carried similar weights. If you could design wings with sufficient area and structural strength, you could make the tank flyable. The military approved development in early 1942. The project was designated A-40, Antonov's 40th design project. The tank selected was T-60, the lightest tank in Soviet service. Specifications: weight 6,400 kilograms, length 4.1 meters, width 2.4 meters, height 1.7 meters. Armament: 120 mm TNSH cannon, 7.62 mm DT machine gun. Armor: up to 35 mm on frontal surfaces. Crew: 2. Maximum speed: 44 km per hour on roads. The T-60 was reconnaissance tank, designed for scouting and infantry support. It was lightly armored, lightly armed, and barely adequate against German tanks. But it was available, and its lightweight made it the only Soviet tank that might feasibly be made to fly. Antonov's design attached biplane wings to the tank hull. The wings were wooden frames covered with fabric, cheap materials that could be manufactured without consuming scarce aluminum or steel. The upper wing had 18-meter span. The lower wing was slightly shorter. The wings were mounted on struts above the hull, positioned to generate lift while keeping the center of lift approximately above the tank's center of gravity. The tail assembly consisted of twin booms extending from the wings to a horizontal stabilizer and twin vertical fins. The configuration was similar to contemporary transport gliders, but scaled for the tank's weight. The landing gear was detachable wheeled assembly that could be jettisoned after landing, allowing the tank to drive away on its tracks. The complete system weighed approximately 7,500 kilograms, 6,400 kilograms tank, 1,100 kilograms wings and structure. The glide ratio was estimated at approximately 3:1. For every meter of altitude lost, the tank could glide 3 meters horizontally. This was poor compared to purpose-built gliders, which achieved ratios of 15:1 or better, but was deemed adequate for short glides from tow release to landing. The tow aircraft was Tupolev TB-3, a heavy bomber from the mid-1930s. The TB-3 specifications: 4 engines producing total 3,000 horsepower, maximum speed 288 kilometers per hour, service ceiling 3,800 meters. The aircraft was obsolete as bomber, but remained in service as transport. Its power and size made it the only Soviet aircraft capable of towing a 7,500 kilogram load. The test occurred at Moscow's Bykovo airfield on August 2, 1942. The A-40 was positioned on the runway, wings attached, landing gear in place. A tow rope connected the tank to the TB-3. The rope was approximately 50 meters long, steel cable capable of handling the stress of towing. Sergei Anokhin, experienced test pilot and glider specialist, was selected to pilot the flying tank. He entered through the turret hatch and positioned himself at the controls. The controls were rudimentary. A control column connected to the tail surfaces through cables, rudder pedals for directional control, a tow release mechanism. The tank's turret was locked in forward position to prevent it from rotating and disrupting the center of gravity. At 0900 hours, the TB-3 began its takeoff roll, the tow rope tightening, pulling the A-40 forward. The tank accelerated, its tracks rolling on the detachable landing gear. At approximately 60 kilometers per hour, the wings generated sufficient lift. The A-40 lifted off, climbing behind the TB-3. Immediately, problems became apparent. The TB-3 struggled to maintain altitude. The drag from towing 7,500 kilograms was enormous. The bomber's engines were at maximum power, but the combined weight of aircraft and glider exceeded the TB-3's performance capabilities at low altitude. The bomber climbed slowly, barely managing to gain altitude. Anokhin felt the tow rope strain. The A-40's controls were heavy, the tank's weight making it difficult to maintain stable flight. The glide characteristics were poor. The thick wing structure created excessive drag. The tank's boxy shape generated turbulence. The overall aerodynamics were barely adequate. The tank flew, but only marginally. At approximately 40 meters altitude, the TB-3 pilot made decision. The tow was unsustainable. If he continued climbing, the engines might overheat or fail. If he maintained level flight, he could not gain sufficient altitude for safe glide landing. The only option was early release. At approximately 0940 hours, 40 minutes after takeoff, the TB-3 released the tow rope. Anokhin was now gliding an unpowered tank with marginal aerodynamic characteristics toward whatever landing site he could reach. The field outside the airfield was agricultural land, relatively flat, clear of obstacles. Anokhin aimed for it. The descent was rapid. The poor glide ratio meant the tank lost altitude quickly. Anokin had minimal control authority. The controls responded slowly. The tank's inertia made maneuvering difficult. He focused on maintaining airspeed and alignment with the landing area. At approximately 50 meters from the field, Anokin jettisoned the landing gear. The wheeled assembly fell away. The tank now flying on wings alone. The goal was to land on the tracks, using them as landing gear. The tracks were robust, designed to handle rough terrain. If the landing was controlled, they could absorb the impact. The tank touched down hard. The impact compressed the suspension. The tracks digging into soil. The wings flexed. Stresses transmitted through the structure, but nothing broke. The tank skidded forward, slowing. The tracks creating furrows in the field. After approximately 50 meters, it stopped. Anokin climbed out of the turret. The tank was intact. The wings were undamaged. The landing gear detachment had worked as designed. The flight had succeeded in the sense that the tank had been towed into the air, had glided to a landing, and could theoretically have been driven into combat if this had been operational mission. But the test also demonstrated fatal flaws. The TB-3 could not tow the loaded tank to sufficient altitude. The maximum altitude achieved was 40 meters, barely enough for controlled glide. Operational use would require releasing at several hundred meters to allow gliding to specific targets. The TB-3 could not reach such altitudes while towing. The solution would require more powerful tow aircraft, but the Soviet Union had no such aircraft available. The Petlyakov P-8 was under development, but would not be available in quantities for years. The TB-3 was the only heavy aircraft available, and it was barely adequate. Alternative proposals were considered. Reduce the tank's weight by removing armor or ammunition, but this defeated the purpose. A lightly armored tank with minimal ammunition was barely more useful than paratroopers. Use multiple tow aircraft, but coordinating multiple aircraft towing a single tank was logistically complex and vulnerable to one aircraft failing. Use the tank's engine to assist during tow, but the T-60's engine was not designed for flight operations, and modifying it would be complex. Every alternative revealed new problems. The fundamental issue was that tanks were not meant to fly. The engineering could make them fly marginally, but could not make them fly well enough for practical military use. The A-40 was technical curiosity, but operational dead end. The program was canceled in late 1942. No official records document the cancellation, but production never began, and no further tests occurred. The single A-40 prototype was either disassembled or lost. No photographs of the actual flight are known to exist. The primary documentation comes from post-war accounts by participants in archives documenting the design process. The A-40 became historical footnote, mentioned in histories of aviation oddities and desperate wartime experiments. It represented category of projects born from crisis, ideas that seem reasonable when survival is at stake, but are recognized as impractical once immediate pressure eases. The Soviet Union in 1942 was desperate enough to try flying tanks. By 1943, with the situation stabilizing after Stalingrad, such experiments were no longer justified. The comparison to Western airborne development is instructive. British and American forces also experimented with delivering armored vehicles by air. The Hamilcar glider, British design, could carry a Tetrarch light tank. The glider worked but revealed limitations. It required specialized construction, needed powerful tow aircraft, and was vulnerable to German fire during landing. The Allies used Hamilcar in limited operations, but recognized that conventional amphibious and ground assaults were more effective for delivering armor. The Soviets reached similar conclusions through different paths. Instead of building specialized gliders and finding they were marginally useful, the Soviets tried converting tanks directly and found that was even less practical. Both approaches demonstrated that delivering heavy equipment by air was possible, but rarely optimal compared to ground transportation. The engineering achievement of making the A-40 fly deserves recognition separate from the concept's military utility. Antonov and his team designed wing structure that could lift 7,500 kilograms using wood and fabric. They created control system that allowed pilot to fly a tank. They solved problems of mounting wings on armored vehicle without compromising the tank's combat capability once wings were detached. The solutions were clever even if the overall project was impractical. Post-war, Antonov became one of the Soviet Union's most successful aircraft designers. The An-2 biplane transport became one of the most produced aircraft in history. The An-12, and 22, and in 124 became standard Soviet transport aircraft. Antonov Design Bureau continues producing aircraft today. The A-40 was early experiment in Antonov's career, demonstrating willingness to attempt unconventional solutions even when conventional wisdom suggested they would fail. The lesson from the A-40 is not that innovation is bad, but that innovation must be evaluated honestly. The flying tank seemed reasonable as concept. Attach wings, tow, glide, fight. The execution revealed problems that made the concept impractical. Insufficient tow aircraft power, poor aerodynamics, marginal operational utility. Recognizing these problems and canceling the program was correct decision. Pursuing the program despite evidence it would not work would have wasted resources. Military history is filled with similar experiments. The Japanese I-400 submarine aircraft carriers were engineering marvels but strategically irrelevant. The German Maus super heavy tank was technically impressive but operationally useless. The British Panjandrum rocket-propelled explosive device was creative but uncontrollable. Each represented engineering capability exceeding practical utility. The A-40 belongs in this category. Projects that demonstrate what can be built if you ignore whether it should be built. The flying tank flew. The achievement was real. But flying poorly for one test flight was not sufficient justification for production. The resources required to build flying tanks could produce conventional tanks, which were desperately needed. The tow aircraft required could transport supplies or paratroopers, both more valuable than gliding tanks. At 0900 hours on August 2, 1942, Sergei Anokin prepared to fly a tank because Soviet military leadership was desperate enough to try anything that might provide tactical advantage. The desperation was understandable. The Soviet Union was losing territory, suffering massive casualties, facing potential defeat. Ideas that seemed crazy in peacetime seemed worth attempting when survival was at stake. The A-40's single flight proved the concept was technically feasible, but operationally impractical. This was valuable information. It allowed Soviet leadership to make informed decision to cancel the program and allocate resources elsewhere. The experiment cost relatively little. One prototype, one test flight, minimal diversion of industrial capacity. The return was knowledge that flying tanks were dead end. The Antonov A-40, Russia's craziest glider experiment, the literal attempt to glue wings onto a tank and fly it to the battlefield, succeeded in flying once and failed at everything else. The success was narrow. The tank achieved flight under tow, glided to landing, landed without destruction. The failures were comprehensive. Insufficient altitude, poor glide characteristics, vulnerable tow aircraft, questionable tactical utility, impossible logistics. The legacy is not the flying tank itself, but the reminder that engineering capability does not determine military utility, that some problems cannot be solved by making existing solutions fly, and that innovation requires honest assessment of whether achieving something difficult is worth the resources required. The T-60 with wings attached flew because Soviet engineers were skilled and determined. But skill and determination could not overcome fundamental mismatch between tanks and aviation, between what could be built and what should be deployed, between engineering achievement and military effectiveness. The craziest ideas are often crazy for good reasons. The A-40 demonstrated those reasons through experimental proof rather than theoretical argument. One flight was sufficient. The flying tank proved that tanks should not fly, that some innovations belong in museums as historical curiosities rather than in production as operational weapons, and that knowing when to cancel programs is as important as knowing when to start them. The wings for tank flew once, landed safely, were detached, and were never attached to another tank, ending the brief history of Soviet flying armor with single flight that proved the concept was possible and simultaneously proved it was pointless.